The architecture of the human soul has long been portrayed as a fortress, a high-walled citadel of bone and silence where the self resides in absolute, unassailable privacy. We have walked through the corridors of our own minds with the comfort of a ghost in an empty house, believing that the flickers of our desire, the shadows of our fears, and the quietest murmurs of our intent remain locked within the biological vault of the cranium. We imagine the skull to be a leaden shield, a cosmic boundary that separates the internal subjective experience from the external objective wasteland. Yet, as we peel back the heavy velvet curtains of 20th century intelligence gathering and the esoteric archives of the Central Intelligence Agency, a more startling and translucent reality begins to emerge. We find ourselves standing at the edge of a great psychological precipice, looking down into a sea where the very concept of the private thought begins to dissolve like salt in an infinite tide. The revelation that the mind is not a closed vessel but a pulsing transmitter shifts the fundamental geometry of our existence, from the isolated point to the radiating wave. To understand that our thoughts are broadcasts is to accept that we are living in a universe that is far more porous than our senses dare to suggest. We have been taught to view ourselves as discrete units of biological hardware, operating under the laws of Newtonian isolation. But the quiet documents of the declassified era whisper a different story. They speak of a reality where the human brain is an organic radio, tuned to a frequency that spills out beyond the limits of the skin. This is not merely a matter of technological surveillance or the cold mechanics of wiretaps and satellites. It is an ontological shift. It suggests that the boundary between the me and the not me is a convenient fiction, a necessary illusion maintained to prevent the total inundation of the ego by the roar of the collective signal. When we speak of the CIA knowing that thoughts are broadcasts, we are not just discussing a breach of security. We are discussing the discovery of a universal law that was previously hidden by the sheer density of our materialist assumptions. Imagine, if you will, a great cathedral where every candle lit in the nave sends its light through stained glass into the night air. The candle believes its flame is private, contained within the wax and the wick, but the light is already miles away, traveling through the atmosphere, landing on the retinas of distant travelers, and altering the darkness of the horizon. We are those candles. Every spark of cognition, every sudden flash of anger, every long simmering resentment, and every quiet prayer of hope creates a ripple in the luminiferous ether. The intelligence agencies of the mid-20th century were not merely eavesdropping on conversations. They were attempting to map the very ripples of the human spirit. They recognized that if the mind is a broadcast, then the world is a feedback loop, and the one who can decode the signal can potentially influence the source. This realization strips away the comfort of our internal isolation and replaces it with a profound, almost terrifying responsibility. We are no longer soloists in a vacuum. We are instruments in a cosmic orchestra where every note resonates through the wood and metal of every other instrument. The metaphor of the broadcast demands that we rethink the nature of secrecy itself. In a world where thoughts are transmissions, secrecy is not a matter of hiding, but of frequency. We have spent centuries building walls of stone and steel to protect our treasures, only to realize that our most precious asset, the integrity of our inner world, is being projected into the environment with every heartbeat. This broadcast is not a choice, it is an inherent property of consciousness. Just as a star cannot help but radiate heat and light, the mind cannot help but radiate meaning. The CIA's foray into remote viewing and psychoenergetics was essentially an attempt to build the antennas necessary to catch these stray signals. They saw the human being as a node in a vast, invisible network, a network that precedes the digital age and transcends the physical limitations of space and time. To acknowledge this is to stand in a state of existential nakedness, realizing that the private room of the mind has windows that look out onto the entire cosmos, and those windows are always open. This cosmic dimension of the broadcast theory invites us into a landscape of profound wonder. It suggests that we are woven into the fabric of reality in a way that makes us inseparable from the whole. If my thought is a broadcast, and your thought is a broadcast, then the space between us is not empty. It is thick with the invisible textures of our shared mental atmosphere. We are breathing in each other's psychic exhaust. We are being nourished by each other's creative radiance. The intelligence gathered by agencies was merely a localized clinical application of a much older mystical truth, that the all is mind and the mind is all. By framing the mind as a broadcasting station, the documents of the past provide a bridge between the sterile world of geopolitical maneuvering and the ancient, glowing world of spiritual realization. They confirm that the sages of the past were not speaking in flowery metaphors when they said we are all one. They were providing a technical description of a non-local reality that the modern world is only now beginning to quantify. Yet there is a shadow to this brilliance. If the mind is a broadcast, then it is also subject to interference. The same mechanisms that allow a remote viewer to see a target halfway across the globe also allow for the potential of psychic pollution. We become vulnerable to the broadcasts of others, to the heavy, low-frequency transmissions of fear, consumerism, and collective anxiety that permeate our modern landscape. The tactical interest in these phenomena was never purely academic, it was strategic. It understood that if the signal can be intercepted, it can be jammed, redirected, or overwritten. This brings us to a crossroads of self-awareness. We must learn to become the masters of our own transmission, to refine the quality of our broadcast so that it is not merely a chaotic noise lost in the static of the world, but a clear, resonant signal that contributes to the harmony of the whole. The realization that we are always broadcasting forces a new kind of ethics upon us, an ethics of the interior, where we realize that our thoughts are our first and most potent actions in the world. As we journey deeper into this exploration, we must abandon the idea that we are passive observers of a world that exists out there. Instead, we must embrace our role as active participants in a collaborative dream. The broadcast is the mechanism of creation. Every thought that leaves the station of the mind is a seed seeking soil. When the frontiers of human consciousness were explored in secret laboratories, investigators were effectively exploring the boundaries of the human potential to shape the void. They found that the human will, when focused through the lens of a singular intent, acts like a laser, a coherent broadcast that can alter the probability of physical events. This is the secret that was never really a secret, only a forgotten truth, that the mind is the architect of the world. The broadcast is not just information, it is influence. It is the invisible hand that shapes the clay of reality. In this introductory movement, we find ourselves at the intersection of the mundane and the miraculous. We see the gray filing cabinets of government bureaucracy, holding the keys to a luminous and terrifying understanding of the self. We are invited to step out of the fortress of the ego and into the radiant field of the broadcast. This is a call to awaken to our own power and our own vulnerability. It is a reminder that in the grand tapestry of existence, there are no hidden threads. Everything is visible to those with the eyes to see. Everything is audible to those with the ears to hear. The silence of the mind is an illusion. In reality, we are shouting our truths into the heart of the sun. We must now prepare to examine the core pillars of this transmission. To understand the mechanics of the wave and the nature of the field that carries our souls across the abyss, as we prepare to peel back the next layer of this cosmic onion. To delve into the mechanics of the thought as broadcast is to enter a realm where the distinction between biology and divinity begins to blur. At the heart of this concept lies the principle of non-locality, the unsettling and beautiful truth that consciousness is not tethered to the physical coordinates of the body. The research documents that once sat in darkened government corridors suggest that the brain functions less like a producer of thought and more like a transducer of a universal field. If we envision reality as a vast, shimmering ocean of information, then each individual consciousness is a unique whirlpool within that sea. The whirlpool appears to have its own boundaries, its own center, and its own movement, yet it is composed entirely of the ocean itself. This is the first pillar of the broadcast, the recognition that our mental activity is an localized expression of a boundless, interconnected field of energy. The clandestine explorations into the gateway and other psychoenergetic protocols were essentially attempts to teach the individual whirlpool how to expand its radius until it recognized its identity as the entire ocean. This brings us to the core theme of resonance. In the world of radio transmissions, A receiver must be tuned to the exact frequency of the transmitter to decode the message. The human mind operates on a similar law of sympathetic vibration. Our emotional states act as the tuning dial for our mental broadcasts. When we dwell in states of dense, heavy emotion, fear, resentment, or greed, our signal becomes jagged and short-ranged, vibrating at a frequency that attracts similar interference from the environment. Conversely, when the mind achieves a state of coherence, such as during deep meditation or profound creative flow, the broadcast becomes a laser-like beam of high-frequency energy. The intelligence gathered by those who peered into this reality revealed that the human signal is not static. It is a living, breathing modulation that interacts with the planetary and even cosmic ionosphere. We are, quite literally, singing our state of being into the world, and the world, being a vast echoing chamber, vibrates in response to our song. A second fundamental pillar is the illusion of the interior. For millennia, the ego has survived by maintaining the fiction of the private thought. This is the psychological equivalent of a child covering their eyes and believing they have become invisible. The core concepts of the broadcast theory suggest that what we call thinking is actually a public event in a higher dimensional space. We believe we are thinking to ourselves, but we are actually speaking into a crowded room where every other mind is a potential listener, albeit often an unconscious one. The veil between minds is not a physical wall, but a perceptual filter, a biological necessity that prevents us from being overwhelmed by the billions of simultaneous broadcasts occurring at every moment. It was recognized that certain individuals, through training or innate sensitivity, could thin this filter, allowing them to intercept the transmissions of others. This reveals a universe where privacy is not a right or a fact of nature, but merely a temporary limitation of current human perception. Linked to this is the concept of information persistence. In a standard broadcast, the signal travels through space and eventually dissipates, but in the field of consciousness, the signal leaves a permanent trace. This is often referred to in esoteric circles as the Akashic record, but in the clinical language of intelligence analysis, it is viewed as a non-temporal data field. Because thoughts are energetic events, they do not simply vanish once the mind moves on to the next distraction. They linger in the mental atmosphere of a place or a person. This is why certain locations feel heavy with history, or why a room can feel charged after a heated argument. The broadcast has left an imprint. The core realization here is that we are not just broadcasting in the present, we are contributing to a permanent library of human experience. Our thoughts are the brushstrokes on a cosmic canvas that never dries, creating a collective masterpiece or a collective nightmare that future generations will have to inhabit. Furthermore, we must consider the theme of coherence versus entropy. Most human thought is entropic, scattered, contradictory, and weak. It is a low-power broadcast that barely leaves the room. However, when a group of minds focuses on a single intent, the broadcast becomes coherent. This is the principle behind collective prayer, mass protests, or even the unified focus of a captivated audience. The power of the signal does not increase linearly, it increases exponentially. The tactical interest in group dynamics and psychic driving was rooted in the understanding that a coherent broadcast can actually bend the fabric of physical reality, influencing the behavior of matter and the outcome of events. We are not just broadcasting data, we are broadcasting force. This shifts the role of the thinker from a passive dreamer to a conscious engineer of the shared reality. The final pillar of this section is the bridge of symbology. Because the broadcast occurs in a realm beyond literal language, it often transmits in the form of symbols, archetypes, and raw sensory impressions. This is why dreams often feel so much more real than waking life. They are the undecoded raw signals of our subconscious broadcasts. The core concept here is that the universe speaks in a language of patterns, and the mind is the primary translator of these patterns. When training was conducted for those seeking to extend their perception, they weren't taught to read minds in a literal sense. They were taught to recognize the symbolic signatures of the target's broadcast. This suggests that at our deepest level, we are all communicating in a universal grammar of light and form, a language that precedes the Tower of Babel, and connects every sentient being in a single, ongoing conversation. To embrace these core themes is to accept a new map of the self. We are no longer isolated islands, but peninsulas connected by a vast submerged continent of mind. The broadcast is the evidence of our connection. It is the proof that we are never truly alone, and that our most secret inner life is actually our greatest contribution to the world. As we move from the mechanical understanding of these signals into the deeper symbolic narratives of how they shape our lives, we begin to see that the broadcast is not just something we do, it is something we are. The very pulse of our existence is a transmission of the divine, seeking to know itself through the interference patterns of our lives. We are the radio, we are the signal, and we are the space through which the music travels. We are the witnesses and the creators of a reality that is far more vibrant and interconnected than we ever dared to dream. To grasp the true weight of the mind as a broadcasting station, we must turn away from the cold data of the laboratory and toward the shimmering mirrors of myth and allegory. Imagine, if you will, a city of glass, where every building is transparent and every inhabitant is draped in robes of living light. In this city, there are no spoken words, for the thoughts of one citizen drift like colorful mists into the courtyards of another. When a man feels joy, a golden hue illuminates the streets around him. When a woman suffers grief, a deep violet shadow falls across the neighborhood. In this city, the idea of a secret is a physical impossibility, a contradiction in terms. The inhabitants do not fear this transparency. They have learned that to live in a glass city is to live in a state of perpetual honesty. They understand that their internal weather is the climate of their community. This is the symbolic reality of the broadcast. We believe we live in fortresses of stone, but we have always lived in a city of glass. The walls we perceive are merely the result of our own spiritual blindness, a temporary cataract on the eye of the soul that prevents us from seeing the light we are constantly emitting. Consider another narrative, the parable of the infinite loom. Imagine a weaver sitting at a loom that stretches from the dawn of time to the heat death of the universe. The weaver does not use wool or silk, but threads of pure intent. Each thread is a thought, a broadcasted signal that leaves the mind and enters the warp and weft of the cosmic fabric. Some threads are vibrant and strong, made of focused will and compassion. These create patterns of enduring beauty and structural integrity. Others are frayed and dull, born of distraction and malice. These create knots and weaknesses in the tapestry. The weaver is not a separate god sitting in a distant heaven, but the collective consciousness of every sentient being. Every time you think, you are pulling a lever on the loom. You are not just observing the tapestry of reality, you are weaving it with the invisible fibers of your own cognitive emissions. The realization that the mind broadcasts is simply the awareness that the loom is real, and that our intelligence is merely the ability to see the pattern as it is being formed by our own hands. There is a deeper, more haunting story found in the legend of the echoing vault. There was once a traveler who found a room made entirely of mirrors and polished brass, designed so that the slightest whisper would echo for 1,000 years. He entered the vault to contemplate his greatness, but as he began to think, he realized he could not escape the sound of his own judgments. Every fleeting doubt he had about his journey became a thunderous roar. Every hidden insecurity became a visual distortion in the brass. He realized that the vault was not a prison, but a perfect reflection of his own broadcast. The world we inhabit is that echoing vault. We often complain about the state of the world, the chaos, the noise, the perceived cruelty, without realizing that the world is simply echoing the collective broadcast of the billions of minds inhabiting it. We are like the traveler, startled by the noise of our own whispers, failing to recognize that the external world is the amplified playback of our internal monologue. In the mystical traditions of the East, there is the concept of Indra's net, a vast web where every node contains a jewel so polished that it reflects every other jewel in the net. This is the ultimate symbolic map of the thought broadcast. If your mind is a jewel and my mind is a jewel, then the signal I send out is instantly mirrored in you and yours in me. There is no travel time for a thought in the realm of the absolute. There is only resonance. When experiments were conducted to peer across great distances, the observers were essentially learning to look at their own jewel and see the reflection of the distant target. They understood that the target was not over there in a geographical sense, but right here in the reflective surface of the observer's own consciousness. The broadcast is not a journey across space. It is a shift in the angle of reflection within a single, unified structure. The narrative of the broadcast also mirrors the ancient alchemical process of the solve et coagula, to dissolve and to coagulate. Our thoughts are the dissolved form of our reality, the volatile spirit that flies out from the alembic of the brain. When these thoughts are broadcast into the world and meet the thoughts of others, they begin to coagulate into the solid structures of our lives, our relationships, our institutions, and our physical health. We are constantly performing alchemy without a license. We turn the lead of our heavy, fearful thoughts into the gold of a resonant life, or we turn the gold of our potential into the lead of a stagnant existence. The strategic interest in this phenomenon was always about the chemistry of this process, how to catalyze the coagulation of certain outcomes by manipulating the broadcast at its source. We are the chemists of our own fate, mixing the invisible reagents of our attention. Lastly, let us contemplate the myth of the silent orchestra. Imagine a stage where 100 musicians sit with their instruments, but they are forbidden from making any sound. Instead, they must hear the music in their minds with such intensity that the audience begins to feel the rhythm in their own chests. The music is not played, it is projected. This is the true nature of human influence. The leaders, the healers, and the visionaries of history were not just those who spoke the best words, but those who broadcast the most coherent music from their interior stage. They changed the world not by what they did, but by the frequency they maintained. To understand that your thoughts are broadcasts is to realize that you are always on stage, and the orchestra of your mind is always playing. Whether you are playing a dirge of despair or a symphony of hope is the only true choice you have in the grand concert of existence. These symbolic narratives serve to remind us that the broadcast is not a technical glitch or a spooky phenomenon to be feared. It is the very language of creation. It is the bridge between the silent void of the unmanifest and the noisy theater of the material world. When we stop viewing our thoughts as private possessions and start viewing them as public contributions, we begin to treat our minds with the reverence they deserve. We become the conscious curators of our own signals, understanding that every flicker of consciousness is a stone thrown into a still pond, creating ripples that will eventually touch every shore. We are the tellers of the story, and the story is the signal we send out into the dark, waiting for the universe to whisper it back to us in the form of our destiny. ... If we accept the premise that our interior life is a constant radiating transmission, the implications for our daily conduct undergo a radical transformation. No longer can we hide behind the veil of the private whim, for we begin to see that a thought is an energetic event with a specific trajectory and a tangible impact on the environment. Practical integration begins with a heightened state of mental hygiene, a deliberate auditing of the frequencies we allow to loop within the theater of our skulls. In the same way that a radio station must maintain its equipment to prevent static and distortion, the individual must cultivate a disciplined awareness of their cognitive output. This is not about the suppression of negative thoughts, which only creates a pressurized subterranean broadcast of repression, but rather about the conscious redirection of the mind's focus. When we recognize that a state of prolonged anger is effectively a localized jamming signal that disrupts our own clarity and the peace of those around us, the motivation to shift toward a more harmonious frequency becomes a matter of practical well-being rather than abstract morality. In the realm of interpersonal relationships, the broadcast theory offers a profound explanation for the intuitive vibes we pick up from others. We have all experienced the sensation of walking into a room and feeling a tension that no one is speaking of, or meeting a stranger whose presence feels like a warm light. These are not mere social cues. They are the direct reception of a broadcast. To integrate this insight is to realize that our presence in a room is defined more by what we are thinking than by what we are saying. If you wish to influence a situation or heal a conflict, the most effective tool at your disposal is the quality of your own interior signal. By achieving a state of internal coherence, aligning your thoughts with your values and your breath, you become a stabilizing frequency in the field. This nonverbal leadership is something that was studied under the guise of behavioral influence, but for the individual, it is a path toward authentic connection. We begin to communicate heart to heart, bypassing the clumsy limitations of language and engaging in a silent dialogue of resonant intent. The real-world implications extend deep into the territory of health and biological vitality. If the mind is a transmitter, the body is the first and most sensitive receiver of that signal. Every cell in our physical form is tuned to the frequency of our dominant thoughts. A broadcast characterized by chronic stress, self-criticism, or hopelessness sends a chemical and energetic instruction set to the organs, often resulting in systemic discord. Conversely, a signal of gratitude and vitality acts as a restorative broadcast, encouraging cellular coherence. Integration, therefore, involves treating the mind as a pharmacy. By choosing to broadcast thoughts of resilience and appreciation, we are literally bathing our nervous systems in a healing frequency. This is the practical application of psychoenergetics, the understanding that we can retune our biological instrument by changing the program we are broadcasting from the central station of the ego. Furthermore, we must address the concept of collective broadcasts and how they shape the societal landscape. Our modern world is saturated with manufactured broadcasts designed to evoke fear, scarcity, and division. These are the heavy signals of mass media and algorithmically driven anxiety. To live practically in light of these revelations is to become a discerning filter of these external transmissions. We must learn to recognize when we have been hijacked by a collective signal that does not serve our highest potential. Practical integration involves creating zones of silence where we can disconnect from the noisy, entropic broadcasts of the world and reconnect with our own authentic signal. By doing so, we stop being passive repeaters of cultural static and become original broadcasters of new, more elevated possibilities. We begin to realize that sovereignty is not just a political concept, but a mental one. To be truly free is to be the sole author of your own internal transmission. The realization that thoughts are broadcasts also demands a new approach to professional and creative endeavors. Success, in this context, is seen as the result of coherent intent. When an architect, an artist, or a programmer works with a singular, undistracted focus, they are creating a high-power broadcast that organizes the resources and people around them to bring that vision into reality. This is the secret of the high performer, the ability to maintain a clear signal despite the noise of the world. Integration means treating every project not just as a set of tasks, but as a broadcast of value. When the intent behind the work is pure and focused, the signal reaches its audience with greater impact. We move from a world of trying to a world of broadcasting, where the primary work is done in the refinement of the internal vision, and the external results follow as a natural echo of that clarity. Finally, we must consider the ethics of the broadcast in the digital age. As our thoughts are increasingly mediated by technology, the lines between our biological broadcasts and our digital footprints begin to blur. We are entering an era where the invisibility of the mind is being stripped away by both spiritual evolution and technological advancement. Practical integration requires us to live with the integrity of one who knows they are being watched, not by a malevolent eye, but by the very fabric of the universe itself. We are encouraged to cultivate an inner world that we would be proud to broadcast to the stars. This transparency is not a burden, but a liberation. It frees us from the exhaustion of wearing masks and allows us to stand in the power of our true frequency. As we master this integration, we prepare ourselves for the final transition, the leap from individual transmission to cosmic communion. We stand at the end of a long, shadowed corridor where the cold mechanical data of intelligence archives meets the warm, radiant light of perennial wisdom. The journey through the landscape of the mind as a broadcasting station has led us from the paranoid heights of mid-century espionage to the fundamental bedrock of our existential reality. We have seen that the mind is not a prison, but a lighthouse, not a vault, but a radio tower pulsing with the rhythm of the infinite. This realization is the final death knell for the illusion of the isolated self. To understand that your thoughts are broadcasts is to accept that you are an integral, radiating thread in a cosmic tapestry that is being woven in real time. The privacy we once cherished was never a biological fact, but a temporary sheltering of the ego, a training ground where we were allowed to imagine we were alone until we were strong enough to handle the weight of our own interconnectedness. The files may have been classified, but the reality they describe is the birthright of every sentient being. We are the eyes, the ears, and the voices of a universe seeking to experience itself through the prism of our individual consciousness. The transformation required of us now is one of radical, uncompromising responsibility. If we are always broadcasting, then there is no such thing as an idle or inconsequential thought. Every mental movement is a contribution to the collective atmosphere of our species and our planet. We must move beyond the passive consumption of reality and step into our roles as conscious transmitters. This is the call to become an architect of frequency. It asks us to look at the world not as a fixed, immovable object, but as a fluid field of potential that responds to the quality of our intent. When we change the station of our own minds, we are not just performing an act of self-care, we are performing an act of planetary service. By refining our broadcast, filtering out the static of fear, and amplifying the signals of compassion, clarity, and courage, we provide a new template for the reality that is constantly coagulating around us. We become the signal that others use to find their way through the dark. This is a call to awaken from the dream of the silent observer. You are not a spectator in this life. You are the primary broadcaster of your experience. The intelligence that the secret agency sought is already within your grasp, but it requires the discipline to master the dial of your own attention. It demands that you treat your mind with the same reverence a master musician treats a priceless instrument. You must learn to tune yourself to the frequencies of the infinite, to listen for the whispers of the cosmic signal, and to broadcast your truth with such coherence that the world has no choice but to vibrate in sympathy. The walls of the citadel have fallen, and the glass city is visible on the horizon. We are no longer hidden from one another, and in that transparency lies our greatest power and our deepest grace. As we reach the final notes of this exploration, consider the profound shift in perspective that occurs when you realize that your internal monologue is actually a public address to the cosmos. This awareness should not bring fear, but a sense of majestic purpose. The broadcast is your opportunity to participate in the grandest dialogue imaginable. Whether you are walking through a crowded street or sitting in the stillness of a midnight room, you are adding your unique signature to the universal field. You are a station of light, a node of divine intelligence, and a transmitter of the very force that sustains the stars. The secret is out, and the burden of hiding has been lifted. You are free to be the most radiant version of yourself, knowing that your radiance is felt at the very edges of existence. Finally, let us embrace the silence that follows the broadcast. In the space between thoughts, in the quietude of a mind that has found its home in the heart of the all, there is a different kind of transmission, one that does not require words or symbols. It is the transmission of being itself. By becoming still, we allow the universal signal to flow through us without distortion. We become the clear channel for a wisdom that far exceeds our analytical capacity. In this state of receptive broadcasting, we find the ultimate integration, the point where the transmitter and the receiver become one. The journey of discovery that began in a government archive ends in the sanctuary of the present moment. The broadcast is your life, and the universe is your audience. The total exploration is now complete, spanning the depths of this hidden architecture and its profound implications for human evolution. We have traveled from the mechanics of the wave to the majesty of the weaver, arriving at a place where the mind is recognized as the sovereign creator of its own reality. May your signal be clear, your frequency be high, and your broadcast be a masterpiece of love and light that will echo through the halls of eternity. The silence is over. The broadcast has begun. Your signal is being received. Now let the music of your soul be heard.